Thank you very much, Vanessa. Great. So I am going to kind of just hand over to Nathan Blake, who is a postdoc researcher at KCL and UCL, and I'll let him give a very brief introduction, and then I think he's going to dive straight into his presentation. But as usual, please ask questions, jump in, prepare them, put them in the chat. There'll be plenty of time to kind of chat at the end. Yeah, over to you, Nathan. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you very much, Lizzie, for having me, and thank you everyone for coming to listen to me. So let me just share my slides quickly before we dive in. And I'll give the obligatory, Lizzie, give me the thumbs up. Thank you very much. So, yeah, welcome everyone. So, Lizzie said, my name is Nathan Blake, postdoc researcher at King's and at UCL. And my background's a little bit weird. I came to computational biology via nursing. I was 12 years a nurse. And I mention that because my nursing background does inform some of the approach I'm going to give in this talk today, particularly taking quite a clinical sort of perspective on what can be quite a theoretical aspect of computer science. So I'm going to talk to you today about explainable AI, particularly for clinical applications. I'm going to look at one particular explainability tool called Causal Responsibility-based Explanations. Going to talk a little bit about what explanations are, what explainability is in a clinical context, what it's not, and how we might go about assessing and validating explainability tools themselves, separate from validating AI models, which are, as we'll see, they're quite distinct issues. Just two quick housekeeping things. I'm going to try to keep an eye on the chat. So if you have any questions as they occur, if you feel free to put them in the chat, I'll try to keep an eye on them and address the questions as they come up. Sometimes it's just easier to address questions as they come. The other thing, a little bit of a challenge to you, there is one image in my entire slide deck which is generated by AI. So there's no prize, but if you want to guess at what the AI generated image is, feel free. Maybe you can be the first with a question afterwards. So let's dive into it. So let's talk about the need for explainable AI in medicine. Like I say, I come from it from quite a clinical perspective. And we have concepts such as informed consent and patient autonomy, which do sort of require that clinicians are able to explain their decision-making to patients. And not all patients necessarily will want the full details of everything, but some patients will, and some patients may not, but we want at least the potential to be able to explain, well, why are we recommending this course of action and not this course of action? Why do we think this particular scan is indicative of disease X, Y, or Z? So we want that to be a part of the chain of reasoning. But with sort of modern machine learning sort of paradigm that we have, you can imagine a system in which we have our scan, let's say an MRI scan in this instance, and let's say we feed it into our AI model, which are quite notoriously quite inscrutable black box models. And it may well be saying, and may well correctly be saying that, okay, this MRI image, it thinks it's cancerous, it thinks it's diseased. But that still sort of leaves the question of why? Why does the AI model classify this particular image as cancerous? And without recourse to that explanation, then concepts like informed consent and autonomy may start to break down, and we might see examples of that later on in the talk. To help address this problem, though, there's various regulations that have sort of come out that require algorithm-based decisions to be interpretable, understandable, and traceable. They've all been sort of put in one place now by the EU's AI Act, which interprets this in terms of what it calls transparency, which means in this setup, the AI systems are developed and used in a way that allows appropriate traceability and explainability. And I think this is relevant even if you're outside of the EU. You have the Brussels effect, which means that Apple have to make the same adapters everywhere. Well, they don't have to make the same adapters everywhere, They just have to make adapters, particular to the European market, but it just so happens to be cheaper and easier for them to make those adapters for international markets so that they're sellable in Europe as well as the rest of the world. And I think, it's quite easy to imagine that something similar is going to happen with regulatory bodies. You have the EU has that regulation, and maybe other people in the world will follow those regulations as sort of best practice. But in addition to that, we also need to engender trust amongst clinicians in AI systems. It's all very well and good us developing these AI systems, but can clinicians actually trust them? And ultimately, especially in the system we have now, clinicians retain legal liability for the decisions. And so if a doctor is making a decision based on something an AI recommends, then I think it's perfectly reasonable that the clinician asks, well, why does the AI recommend this course of action? However, the need for explainable AI is not universally accepted in the medical literature. And it's just for a couple of reasons. We'll get into this. But maybe a nice explanation is to understand the sort of modern scientific medical paradigm, which is evidence-based medicine, which is statistical in nature. What it asks is, does smoking cause cancer? Well, the answer given is statistical in nature. We know that at a population level, people who smoke are more likely to get cancer. And then there are other bits of evidence as well that look at the biological plausibility. But by and large, it's a sort of statistical, in the theory of sort of causality, the philosophy of causality, this would be called type causality, this sort of high level sort of overview. And some people argue that this paradigm is enough. We could take the example of paracetamol, for instance. So paracetamol or acetaminophen, any Americans out there, very ubiquitous analgesic, everyone's probably taken it. But fundamentally, we don't actually know exactly how it works. We know a few things. It works on the peripheral nervous system and cyclooxygenase and all that sort of business, but fundamentally, we don't know why it works. But we know that it does work. Its efficacy profile is very well attested to, and we also know its safety profile very well within certain constraints. And so from a statistical level, we understand paracetamol from that perspective. So some people argue that, in fact, explainable AI is not needed. And that's what this first paper here is referring to, believing in black boxes, that explainability is not needed for it to be evidence-based. There are other complaints about explainability, and we'll go into more detail about these later on, but false hope of current approaches to explainable AI in healthcare. This paper raises a number of perfectly legitimate questions about explainability, which we'll dive into. But just from a high-level overview, I just want to say that I don't think these two approaches are mutually exclusive, that we can have this sort of more top-down approach where you take a statistical approach, but we can also have this more bottom-up approach, which is what personalized medicine really aims to be, where we can actually say why, in a particular instance, why does this individual have this particular disease? And they're not mutually exclusive. That's my feeling anyway. So what is explainable AI, particular to a medical context? Well, unfortunately, there's a lack of consensus in a definition of explainability, and that's just in the medical literature. If you open it up to the computer science, computer vision literature, it gets even worse. Terms like explainability and interpretability trust often used interchangeably, and we'll see some examples of that later on in the talk. However, like I say, I come at it from a very clinical perspective, and if anecdotally or indeed in terms of this survey that I'm referencing here, you ask clinicians what do they want from explainable AI. They normally talk about it in terms of justifying clinical decision making. So that feeds back into that what I was talking about before in terms of informed consent and patient autonomy. So they very much understand explainability within that framework. And to that end, certainly current applications of clinical AI, clinicians seek to understand models that align with features that are known in the current evidence base. So, you can well imagine a world in which AI is picking up features which are hitherto unknown to clinicians. But if an AI system starts to do that off the bat, you're probably going to be more suspicious and think, actually, are you picking up spurious features? Much more likely it's picking up spurious features. So certainly in the short to medium term, and probably going on into the long term, you're going to want to look to find models that find features that align with current evidence base in order just to robustly establish that level of trust. And related to this, if a model fails, which we'd expect to happen, right? Medicine is all about risk benefit, sort of a balancing act. And it's not without risk, and things we expect things to fail in certain instances, and so too in AI we can expect it to fail in certain instances. That's fine, because a good medical system should be robust to failures. And for really a patient to suffer from a failure, there's got to be a chain of failures as opposed to a single point of failure. But still, within that framework, what we really like to be able to do is, if in that chain of failures, one of the links is AI, well, at the moment, the trail goes cold. It's just, well, AI did something wrong. Why? We don't know. So it'd be nice to actually have some clarity as to, well, why did the AI system fail, so that we can take mitigating steps, and hopefully whatever that point of failure is, we can actually go back and address it. For the rest of this talk, we're going to proceed based on all the above. We're going to proceed with the assumption that a good explanation is one that localizes to clinically relevant features. And we're going to start with images. Images are just a little bit more intuitive to understand, and it's what we've been looking at. But we do then later on expand that to other medical image types. I'm just going to have a quick look to see if there's any questions in the chat and have a quick sip. So it doesn't look like there's any questions. Like I say, do feel free to put them in the chat if anything, as they occur to you. So before we look at anything else, let's look at the sort of more general general setting of sort of computer vision and ask, well, what is an explanation? And moving away from medicine for a moment into a world I know nothing about, the world of ornithology, let's take a picture and let's put it into our black box model. So, this could be your standard on a ResNet or whatever deep learning architecture you prefer. And, it will give an output. And in this case, it says it's a peacock. Okay, that's all well and good, correct. But the question arises, well, why? Why does this particular black box model, AI model, think this particular image is indeed a peacock? So what might be nice, is that we have some kind of feature selection. And the features in this instance are pixels of an image. So it'd be nice to be able to say, okay, the AI system thinks this is a peacock because of this subset of pixels. And in this particular instance, it's quite intuitive, right? I don't know, actually. I know nothing about ornithology, but just to my sort of lay understanding, that patterning of feathers, okay, I can understand why an AI model would think that is indeed a peacock. So to that end, we've developed a system to extract these kind of explanations. This system, as we'll see, it's based on causal reasoning, counterfactual reasoning in particular, to extract a minimal, or really an approximately minimal, but sufficient non-trivial subset of pixels, which is to say, if you take this image on the right-hand side, this subset of pixels is sufficient to cause this particular model to classify as a peacock. So going into the details now of what causal responsibility explanations are. So I'm not too sure how technical people want this to be. So if you want more technical details, just do put them in the chat. But I'm going to give you quite a high level overview of how Rex works. So we start with an image. And the first thing we do is we partition it, and we partition it randomly. So we've got these 4 segments here. It could have been any size. We could have had a tiny little box here, 2 slithers here, and then a big box here. So this partitioning is random, and that randomness is important to how the algorithm works. But once we've partitioned the image like this, what we're going to want to do is we're going to occlude various parts of the image in a combinatorial way, by which I mean, in this instance, for instance, we've taken the top left-hand corner, the bottom right-hand corner, and just occluded those parts of the image, leaving the other 2 parts. But we'll do this for every possible combination. So you can imagine we could take the top 2, or just the bottom 2, or just 1 region, or 3 regions, and every possible combination of. from there, we then, taking those regions, we then put them into the model, and we simply ask, well, what is this? What is this? Is it still a peacock? Does it retain its classification? If it doesn't retain the classification, we just throw everything away and we start with another iteration, another partitioning. But if it does, well, we could say, okay, these two regions here, they're in some way responsible for this model classifying as a peacock. So what we do is we say they share the responsibility. We just say that the responsibility needs to sum to one. There's two regions, and these two regions share the responsibility. So every pixel in those two regions gets a score of 0.5. Then what we do is we drill in a little bit further. So we sort of branch in two ways. We take one of these two regions and we start again. We then ask, well, we got this region, we partition it into four, again, random regions, and then we again randomly occlude in a combinatorial way. In this instance, 3 regions were occluded, leaving just 1 region. And again, we put it into the model, ask, has it retained its classification? And if it has, okay, great, it's responsible in some way for this classification. In this case, it's the only region, so it gets a responsibility of 1. And we just keep on doing this process again and again and again and so on until we get to, but there's various stopping criteria. And the responsibility score keeps on accumulating for those pixels which do score. And that's just one partition. We then return back to the top and go back to the second partition that we found. And again, same process, we partition it, we query the model, it returns responsibility, and so the responsibility sort of accumulates in this way, and so on and so on. And that's just for the first iteration. And then we repeat the process for the second iteration. You can see the second iteration, the random partitions are slightly different shaped and different scores and so on. And we just repeat that process, eventually building up what other people may refer to as a saliency landscape. We refer to it as a responsibility landscape just because of the nature of responsibilities I explained before. And eventually what that does is that builds up this heat map. And for some people, for some applications, maybe this heat map is enough. That's already informative. But we go one step further in, and what we do is we actually extract an explanation, what we call an explanation from that. So what we do is we take just the very tip of this landscape. We take those pixels, we query them into the model and ask, well, is this a peacock? And if the answer is no, it's probably no. We then go down and take a larger slice and a larger slice, keep on querying the model until eventually at some slice, it says, okay, this is actually a peacock. So that's the process. It's just as a bit of an aside, it's quite interesting for me, sort of with a more clinical background, working in this field, because I work with Hannah Chokla, who's a professor of AI at King's College. So she's the one who's sort of developed a lot of this theory, or so I thought. But when I started working for her, she said, oh, you need to read up on your David Hume. David Hume, the 18th century philosopher. And so, yes, so he was one of the early pioneers of looking at counterfactual reasoning. And I just find it fascinating because, there's other mathematicians and computer scientists like Joe Halper and Judea Pearl. So these are quite big names in the computer science sort of world who've been looking at this. And it's just really interesting to see the intersection of how philosophy gets explained in sort of mathematical terms and how the mathematics gets transcribed into computer code. And then at my end, from this computer code, I get these clinical applications. It's just a really interesting intersection. Just before we go on, I'm just going to have another sip of water and just look again, see if there's any questions in the chat. Cool. No questions in the chat. I'll take it. And no one wants to go into more technical information, which suits me. This is what I'm most interested in. So it's all well and good. Okay, we have this explainability tool. Okay, great. But so what? And does it work? How do we actually validate that these explanations are actually useful? And it's interesting just to take a little step back for a moment here, because as I mentioned before, there's people in the medical community who think that explainable AI isn't needed. And I spoke about some of the theoretical reasons why that might be in terms of evidence-based medicine, but there are more practical concerns of that. And I think the best illustration of that is these Decide AI guidelines. So these guidelines, I don't know if people know, like if you've got a clinical background, you probably know that you have various guidelines for publication, things like the STARD guidelines for if you're going to publish a paper in diagnostic accuracy, or if you're running a randomized controlled trial, you're going to have to follow the consort guidelines. So recently, a few years back now, actually, Decide AI guidelines have come out. So these are guidelines aimed at anyone who's leveraging AI in any capacity for sort of a clinical use. So if you're not aware of them and you are in that space, it's well worth having a quick look at them. But the reason I mention them here is they do talk about, well, actually, they talk about interpretability, by which what they mean as interpretability, I mean as explainability. So that just goes back to what I was saying before, that these sort of nomenclature isn't quite crystallized yet. So they talk about explainability being something that would be nice to have, but currently there's no generally accepted way of quantifying or evaluating interpretability or explainability in this sense, which is quite interesting because there are actually quite a few explainability tools out there. Anyone in this space will probably heard of things like SHAP and LIME and GradCam. They're probably the sort of more common ones, certainly in the medical sort of space. But they're saying actually these explainability tools aren't good enough for clinical utility. And this is a much higher bar. You can perfectly understand why there's such a high bar for clinical applications, which makes it a little bit harder for these tools. Actually, while I'm on, not many people even attempt to validate their explainability tool. So I haven't put it here, but I was reading a literature review recently on brain MRI scans, I believe it was. They identified 22 studies which employed explainable AI to brain tumors. And what they found is out of those 22 that used XAI, only 3 attempted to validate their explainability tool at all. So there is a pressing need for it. And to that end, people like Jin and others have identified various criteria on which you can base your assessment of. And they talk about it in terms of understandability, by which they just mean that you don't need a PhD in computer science to understand the output of the explainability tool in order to get some kind of interpretation of it. Clinical relevance, hopefully that's quite straightforward, and that sort of feeds back into what I was talking about before with regard to clinicians understanding the output and it being aligned with current sort of clinical understandings of disease processes. But interestingly, it's the last two, truthfulness and informative plausibility, that actually the two criteria on which most medically applied XAI generally fails. Truthfulness simply meaning that the explainability tool accurately reflects what the model is doing. And we'll look at some examples of how that fails sometimes. And then you've also got informative plausibility, which just looks at the effectiveness of explainability in sort of subsequent clinical utility to reveal the flaws or biases of an AI. And so that just means that the explanation is able to fit into clinical workflows in a timely and relevant manner. So bearing all this in mind, um, bearing all this in mind, what we wanted to do for Rex, for our tool, we wanted to actually look at a way of validating this tool. So I'll let people read the details on the left if you're interested. What we did is we obtained this data set. It's a BRATS data set, BRATS 2018, I believe, which you can get via the Kaggle, one of the Kaggle challenges. So it's publicly available. And what we did, we obtained a model, we obtained the classifier. So they're all diseased brains, they all have gliomas, all have brain cancers. And MRI, they all have slices of MRI. So it's not 3D data, it's slices, 2D data. And this classifier was built, I think it was a ResNet 50 model. It was just classified a slice as either healthy or unhealthy. But the reason we liked this data set to try to validate Rex was because actually initially, as part of the Kaggle challenge, it was a segmentation task in the first instance, which means that we have these clinical annotations of clinically relevant features, i.e. outlines of where the tumors are. So we have some kind of ground truth. Now, the thing is, this particular model, it's not a particularly clinically useful model. It's a bit of a toy model, but the reason we wanted to use it is because even though it's not clinically relevant, it's relevant to us in that at least it has a ground truth. So at least we can start to get to the bottom of whether these AI tools are looking at the features that we think that they should be looking at. I can see someone's put in the chat. Well, maybe that's the review I was talking about. Hope so. Thanks for that. So we put Rex through this data set, or rather we queried the model onto Rex. This is just another overview of the slide that you saw before, sort of said in another way, just sort of highlighting how the responsibilities are sort of summed and then normalized. But the output, well, we get a result of something like this. So let me just talk you quickly through this slide. There's quite a lot going on. First thing to notice, if you just take any one of these images, three different colors to pay attention to. You've got a dark gray, which is just the background. We've got the light gray, which is the explanation. And we have this sort of what's really a dark red as the ground truth. So this is the clinically or the human annotation. This is where the clinicians have annotated as being where the tumor is. And then what we have in the rows are 4 slices of the MRI. These are the 4 same slices across the rows. And in the columns, we have 6 different explainability tools. Rex is the one we've developed on the right-hand side. We have some of the more common ones in the middle. And we have GradCam here on the left. For those who know this space will probably recognize that GradCam's a bit of an outlier here. And that GradCam is what's sometimes referred to as a white box method. What that means is GradCam can look inside the model. So it gets the model weights. And from the model weights, it sort of develops its saliency landscape, whereby all the other 5 models don't look inside. They don't look inside the model. All they need to be able to do is query the model and get the output. Is it still classification 1 or 0, whatever the case may be? That's all. And we found that's actually quite important because we work with many clinical colleagues now. And even if we're from the same institution, actually a lot of clinicians aren't willing to share their models with us, which surprised us a little bit. But it doesn't actually matter too much for these so-called black box explainability tools. Like I say, they just need to be able to cool the model, whereas GradCam does actually need to sort of peer under the hood a little bit. But we included GradCam here just because it sort of it should, in some sense, maybe not be quite the gold standard, but because it can look inside a model, it'll be useful just to compare our outputs to. And I won't go into too much detail. One thing to mention quickly, don't worry too much about these numbers for the time being. We'll just have a sort of a qualitative look at them. But it's interesting to know that this is, in some sense, this top row is Rex's worst performance. The bottom row is Rex's best performance. And the 2 in the middle are the median and the mean performance by Rex. And I think probably the most interesting thing I'll just draw your eye to, maybe it jumped out to you straight away, is just how different the explanations are. Now, if you start looking closely, for the most part, they kind of all do localize to the tumor. Integrating gradients is probably an unfair comparison for integrated gradients. If you look very closely, you can actually see integrated gradients is actually picking up clinically relevant regions. It's just on this sort of output, which we sort of had to standardize for all the tools, it maybe doesn't look like that is. But it's quite interesting, right? And you've got GradCam, for instance, picking up the whole brain here. And you've got the subarachnoid space as well. Interesting also to note how many explainability tools focus on the front of the brain. And we'll come back to that in a moment. So this is just a quick way of saying, okay, we have all these explainability tools, and they all are doing something different, really. And that's quite worrying. That's quite concerning. But trying to move beyond a qualitative comparison. We try to move to a more quantitative comparison. We did this in a number of ways. Perhaps the easiest sort of way to visualize is the dice coefficient, which just intuitively, it's just if you have X, which is, let's say that's the explanation, and we have image Y, which is the ground truth, the clinically annotated ground truth. What the dice coefficient asks is just find the intersection. So where do those two images overlay? Take twice that value and divide it by the total sum. So you can imagine, if you have your images perfectly aligned, 2 times that divided by the sum of those, the highest you can score is 1. Whereas if the images don't overlap at all, then it's going to be 0. And by this particular measure, again, Rex performs favorably, although the error bars, these are just one standard deviation. The error bars are absolutely huge. And again, integrating gradients, just for various reasons. The technical challenge of this was actually quite difficult. So integrated gradients is probably not as bad as this quantitative measure says. But there are problems with trying to quantify this performance. And if we look at a sort of qualitative example, we can start to see that. So what I've just taken is taken 2 examples. These are both Rex explanations. On the left-hand side column, you've got the sort of the ground truth, the real image, and on the right-hand side, the explanations. In the first instance, you can see Rex is very well. It's aligning with the clinically annotated region quite well. So it scores pretty highly according to these metrics. If you look at the next one, it's completely off base. It's the tumor is out over in this corner here, and this is highlighting a part of the eyeball. And as we remember from the previous slide, there's quite a few of those tools which did sort of highlight eyeballs. And at first we thought, what's going on? The explainability tools just not working properly. Although it was odd that all the tools were kind of doing the same sort of thing. We were speaking with one of our colleagues who's a neuroradiologist at King's, and he was saying, oh yeah, actually no, that's something we've observed before. A lot of the models that they train for detecting tumors in particular do often pick up eyeballs. So perhaps that's something that the model is actually doing. It is actually picking up eyeballs and saying that eyeballs are tumors. And the reason this neuroradiologist gave, he sort of believed that, okay, the tumors, one of the defining features of many tumors is that they're sort of, they have, at least as seen on an MRI scan, they can have quite hard borders sometimes, as can eyeballs are being quite encapsulated. And so that's the feature that actually the model has learned to detect. And in this case, you can see that actually that'll be useful, even though the model's not doing what you want it to do. Well, we don't mind so much what the model is doing as sort of developers of an explainability tool. What we care about is faithfully capturing what the model is doing. And if the model is indeed localizing to eyeballs, we want it to accurately reflect that. And so we think this is maybe quite a nice failure in that it seems to be that we can actually find these points of failures. And so this is just sort of hints at one of the possible clinical utilities for this. If we can actually say, and this model had very good performance metrics. I think it was like 92% accuracy. I can't remember the sensitivity and specificity, but it's like, but by traditional metrics, it was a very high performing model. But we can now, by applying explainability, we can see actually it's not picking up clinically relevant features, it's picking up eyeballs. And so we maybe go back into the training loop and look to why that is. Is it a problem with the model itself? Is it a problem with the data? And indeed, in MRI imaging, something we weren't aware of when we started looking at this, for instance, people do what's called skull stripping. So they'll take out, computationally, they'll take out the skull because the skull often actually interferes with diagnosis, with classification, and to eyeballs, apparently. So that's just a sort of a rough idea of how explainability might be relevant to clinical applications for images in this case. However, we feel we really haven't got to the bottom of this. This isn't really a really good clinical validation. So we're still working on trying to get this proper clinical validation. So the next step, I'm going to take you into a slightly another world. I'm not going to go into too many details of this, but I'll put on my UCL hat for a moment, where I work in vibrational spectroscopy. You don't need to know the details of this at all. Just it's sort of an optics-based technique which looks at a scattering of photons to say something about the biochemistry of samples. and we hope to be able to use this to diagnose cancers. I think the two things to sort of note here is that it's a one-dimensional input as opposed to the two-dimensional images we were looking at before. So it's slightly simpler, more simplified. But the other reason is this is how should I put it? It's more of a sort of basic physical process. And so the sort of the noise behind how Raman spectra, this is the Raman spectrum, how these spectra are generated is we understand it quite well, which means we can simulate these pretty well. So what we were able to do with Raman spectroscopy is basically create a ground truth. So instead of having a clinically annotated ground truth, we directly put the ground truth signal in. And we did that for this particular case, did it in 3 instances. We sort of generated the first case where there's one and only one clinically relevant diagnostic peak. So if the model is learning anything, it must only be learning one of those 2 peaks. And that was actually harder than it sounds, because trust me, if you're building any kind of deep learning architecture, it will pick up at any spurious features, any data leakage. Oh my, it really will pick it up. So it was a exercise in caution, if nothing else. But eventually we're able to get to a place where we could train a model and be confident that it's just picking up those features that we seeded into the data set. And we did it with increasingly complex Raman spectra. And then we were able to do the same sort of thing. We go through into put it through to Rex. It's a pretty similar overview that I showed before of partitioning. But the one thing I want to draw your attention to with this, and I will have to explain a little bit about Raman spectroscopy here, but not too much. When we occlude these regions, so let's take this iteration 2. So we occlude it into we partition it into those 4 regions, 4 random regions. And what we would like to do is occlude some of those regions. However, an occlusion in the case of Raman spectroscopy isn't as simple as setting the value to 0 as it was with images. Although there's a case of maybe that's also not the best thing for images. But let's come back to Raman spectroscopy for now. 0 has a very definite physical meaning. In particular, it just means that the charge coupled device, the CCD that you use to detect photons, has saturated. And you would expect that to be in the training data, and you'd expect models to have seen that before. And so that's a real artifact. And so we wanted to avoid doing that. So we needed to think about, well, what's uninformative? That's what the occlusion has to be. It has to be uninformative. So just for a first approximation, what we did is we just took these occluded regions and we just linearly interpolated those regions. And then once you have this linear interpolation, and you can see how the linear interpolation sort of will get rid of peaks. And then we query them to the model, do they pass or fail, and so on. And from that, we can build up the same responsibility map. We haven't yet applied extracting explanations to this, but you can just see from the responsibility map that, at least to a first approximation, qualitatively speaking, it's aligning to those model features that we seeded into there. So that's finding the ground truth signal that we put in there. So that's quite gratifying to know that happens. The nature of these occlusions, we'll continue to refine those. You can well imagine, these straight lines aren't really what Raman spectra. If you know nothing else about Raman spectra, hopefully you can see they don't necessarily reflect what's going on here. You have this sort of Poisson noise here, and then they're not straight lines. So we're playing with ideas of adding noise and adding cubic splines to make it smoother and so on, just finer refinements. But it turns out, actually, to a first approximation, this works reasonably well. So how do we imagine this sort of fitting in with the clinical workflow? So the overall AI clinical workflow, not just the XAI clinical workflow. Well, in the first instance, just take a very high level overview where you have your data which you use to build your model. The model then gives your classifications. Maybe it's making a diagnosis or whatever it is. Then we extract the explanation from that. And so the explanation is at least in one imagining, it's a way of getting a human back in the loop. So you can get a clinician to actually look at that explanation, like with the case with the eyeballs, and go back to the model and go, okay, this model is picking up spurious features. You need to go back to the model, or maybe you even want to go back further before the model and go back to the data. Maybe there's bias that you're picking up in your training data itself. So hopefully it'll be able to inform the training of the model itself. However, once we have trust in both in the models themselves and in the XAI tools as well, then hopefully we can go back and look at diagnosis as well. So in this sort of workflow, you can imagine, for instance, radiologists looking at certain scans, there needs to be two of them, and in tandem, they'll independently come up with their decisions. So what I'm imagining of AI is to have, instead of two clinicians, is to have one clinician and one AI sort of making that decision. But you can well imagine it if the clinician, if the radiologist and the AI sort of disagree, the clinician is going to want to look at what the AI model is doing. Why is it made that choice? And so by having XAI, it should hopefully get back into that diagnostic pipeline and give more confidence for the clinician either to stick to their guns and say, no, actually this AI model is looking at features that either don't fit in with current understanding or features that we know are spurious, or actually, no, I will change my mind. Actually, it's drawn my attention to something I missed before. So that'd be sort of an ideal case. But even going beyond that, we might then go further and look at hypothesis generation. Because you can imagine a world, like I mentioned before, in which these AI models are powerful enough to pick up features that currently clinicians aren't using. In the first instance, we might not just want to trust them off the bat, but we might use them to feed back into the research pipeline and go, okay, these AI systems keep on picking up these features. What's going on there? Is there something real that we can research? And so it might be the seed of some actual real research. Just gonna have a quick look. There's just a question that's come in. Oh my, it's quite a long question. I might save that. I'm going to save that question to the end because it's quite a long question. So I'll finish up. There's only one more slide. So we've expanded Rex to various biomedical applications. We've been, for instance, working with Anita Griagoridis, who's interested in histopathological data for breast cancer risk stratification. Adrian Flanagan, she's a histopathologist at UCL, and together we're looking at a particular type of bone cancer prognosis. We are also looking at triaxial accelerometer data. So that's just wearable devices sort of data. And Matt Williams at Imperial College, he's interested in using that sort of accelerometer data. So basically movement to see if we can identify patients at risk of clinical deterioration before traditional signs. But in his particular instance, these are patients who are going for, in some cases, chemotherapy or radiotherapy, and so they will have periods of senescence anyway. So what we'd like to do is build an explainability tool on top, so to help distinguish what the model is picking up. Is it picking up the spurious senescence that you might expect anyway, or is it picking up sort of real clinical features that are prognostic of deterioration? We're also looking to expand this. Like I say, the images we looked at before were 2D images, but we're working with people like James Cole at UCL, Thomas Booth at King's, so they're sort of neuroimaging professor and a neuroradiologist, looking to make 3D images of MRIs, PET CT scans, and for diagnosis of things like Alzheimer's disease. And Alzheimer's disease is an interesting one from us from a technical perspective, because I've been talking predominantly about cancers, and you can imagine most cancers, they do localize to images, to regions in an image. So an explanation kind of makes intuitive sense in that context. But Alzheimer's is much more of a global disease. So you get overall brain shrinkage, even though you do get sort of things like certain areas, parietal regions may shrink more than others. It's still an interesting challenge for us. And so just to finish, so Rex is something that's under active development. It's just about gone public. I'll give some information in the next slide, but we are interested in people applying Rex to all kinds of things. So we won't do the research for you, won't do the explanations for you, but we're more than willing to help, especially if you have in mind applications that I haven't perhaps mentioned yet, because hopefully you've got the idea by now, if nothing else, that when we look at these explanations, there's a lot of explainability tools out there. And I think one of the reasons they're not applicable to clinical problems is that they're not bespoke for clinical problems. So things like the nature of occlusions, like I was talking about Raman spectroscopy, just having to think about, well, okay, what kind of occlusions really are non-informative? For instance, if you look at chest CT scans, black regions is how the lungs manifest, and actually tumors come up in grey. So if you're putting black regions there, actually maybe that's non-informative. Maybe you want to use a median value or a mean value. There's all these kinds of decisions. So we'll be happy to sort of liaise with you and sort of making those sorts of decisions. Last little thing I'll finish on. I mentioned Hannah Chocolate. She's my boss. Basically, this is all based on her work, her theory. So if you want more information about the technical aspect of this, I would recommend you go to her website. Like I said, the sort of the philosophy and the maths behind actual causality, the framework, it's a fascinating field. Also got David Kelly here. So I've been talking about Rex quite a lot. Actually, David is the one who's done all the work. He's done all the programming. If you're interested in having a look at Rex and maybe using it, this QR code links to our GitHub repository. You can also check me out on my website. So these students, Fatima, Chinya, Santiago, Milane, they've all been involved in work which I've been mentioning in this talk. But Aditi's been doing something quite interesting. She's been looking at not medical applications, but I think it's interesting nonetheless. She's interested in deep fakes and that sort of arms race between deep fake generation and deep fake detection. So she's interested in using explainability to sort of fit into that arms race and sort of give one more tool to the deep fake detectors. And just thanks to Chai as well. Chai, apparently there's many organizations called Chai going around now. But this one, the EPSRC Hub for Causality in Healthcare AI with real data, helping fund some of this work. So just a big thanks to that. Thanks, Lizzie, for putting the for putting Hannah's email in there. With that, I think I'll have a quick look at the questions. I saw a few of them come up. They're quite long, so I'm just going to take a sip of water while I have a quick read of it.
Thank you so much, Nathan. Yeah, really interesting. I would also encourage anyone else to pop any questions in the chat, or also feel free to put your hand up and unmute. And we can maybe, if Nathan's, oh, maybe the slides are useful, but also welcome to stop sharing the slides if you would like to see people.
Oh yeah, always nice. I think
Yeah.
okay, I'll just give a chance just if people want to use the QR code quickly
Yeah, of course.
while I read. Michael's interesting question here, which is as I understand it, I think I will just stop sharing now. It is nicer to see people. So yeah, a really interesting question, Michael. My honest answer is I don't know. We do work, we quite often work with lawyers and sort of researchers who are in the sort of legal domain about these sorts of things. Certainly they are thinking about causality in a more general sense. But I think it could be, it certainly has the potential to be applicable to legal matters as well. The problem at the moment is that question of robustness. So, this is the complaint that some people have in the medical community, that these XAI models, they're just not robust enough. They're not truthful in the sense that they don't necessarily localize to those features that you necessarily want. If that could be more thoroughly validated, then certainly I think there could be a use case for it there. Although that's not something, like I say, it's not something I've personally thought about, but yeah, I don't see why not. Let's have a look at another question. So someone's having a go to see if the peacock image is AI generated. That was a stock image. I can't actually, you caught me out a little bit. I can't guarantee it's not AI generated. I got that image from David, who's not here. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that that wasn't the one. I'm pretty sure it wasn't the AI generated one. If so, wouldn't the model pick up features that might be away from the ground truth? Yeah, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. Could the model pick up features that might be away from the ground truth? That is an absolutely a real thing that can happen. The thing is, we want the explainability tool to be able to pick that up. So there's two distinct independent things going on here. You have the XAI model itself. you have the AI model itself, and that'll be classifying based on whatever features it's learned, whether they be real features or spurious features. And so we want the explainability tool to be able to pick up whatever it is that the whatever the AI model is doing. Hopefully that's answered your question. Oh,
I think there's also somebody asking if you could pop the GitHub link in the chat as well, if you have access to that.
yes.
Yeah. And I think you've got another question from Ian in the chat as well, which is, in the absence of saturation in the training set, did you manage to show whether linear interpolation is better than inserting zeros?
Hi Ian, I know Ian quite well. So hi Ian. Wasn't expecting any random people in here either. So that's a particularly interesting technical question. You caught me out a little bit here because actually in our simulation data set, we didn't put any saturations in. So actually for that particular application, it wasn't explicitly, it wasn't really needed. But the reason we put it in is because going on into the future, we do have actually another ground truth data set, which we've generated in the lab. So what we've done is we've sort of concocted a biochemical soup, various lipids and proteins and whatnot, things that you might typically find in a typical sort of biological tissue. And into one of the samples, we add DNA. And so then we acquired a Raman spectra, and some of those will be saturated. And then, you know, because we have the sort of DNA signals, we have some sense of the ground truth. We're better see if the explainability tool is able to pick up those DNA peaks that we expect. So that's just another step in the explainability tool. So hopefully that answered your question, Ian. If not, we can always have a chat about it later. And then there's one more question I can see here from Helen Blake. Do you think there is scope to build in explainability tools? So yes, at 100% there is sort of scope to it. It's orthogonal to the work that we're doing. So our work in explainability is sort of a bolt on. So you have your explainability. Keep on making that mistake. You have your AI tool, and then we apply explainability sort of at the end of it. So it's a post hoc system. But yes, certainly there are people who are trying to apply, especially in the Chai Hub, they're trying to apply causal reasoning to see if they can sort of come up with a chain of reasoning. So that the explanation is sort of built into it. So that's work in progress. It's not work that we do, but it's work in progress that our colleagues do. At the moment, as I understand it, I don't think there's anything sort of definitive, at least nothing that could be clinically useful at the moment. And it might be some time before there is. Whether it works or not, or works well enough is an open question. And in the meantime, I think you're going to probably want these post hoc explainability tools to have a look. So hopefully that's answered everyone's questions, but feel free if there's any more.
Thank you so much. I'm just aware of keeping an eye on the time, as I know it's the end of a Monday for most people. But yeah, thank you again to Nathan for joining us today. Feel free, I think Nathan hopefully is happy if anybody has a burning question to get in touch with Nathan. If you do have a few seconds to find the GitHub link and put it in the chat, I think a few people were interested.
I'll do that
rather
now.
than just yeah, that would be great before we close the room in case people want to kind of have a look. But yeah, thank you.